Hello, today I will be teaching Japan's colonization, First March movement and the growth of Korean nationalism, institutional transformation 1910 to 45. Korea's modern history was profoundly influenced by its 35 years 1910 to 45 as a colony of Japan. The Japanese colonial regime established the basis of many of the economic, educational, governmental institutions of Korea, while its authoritarian rule, its mass mobilization, campaigns, and its attempt at forced assimilation touched the lives of every Korean after distributing and even traumatizing ways. As Koreans responded to the demands, opportunities, and the challenges presented by the colonial regime, they developed the ideological division that would be so important in determining the course of their history after 1945. The first decade of colonial rule was particularly harsh, what Koreans have called the dark period. It was characterized by harsh political repression that shifted cultural as well as political life. The press was under tight control, police permits were required for any public gatherings, and all organizations and meetings deemed political in nature were prohibited. To emphasize their authority, Japanese officials, even school teachers, were swords, although Koreans were not allowed to own any type of weapons. This harsh administration took place in an atmosphere of troubled and tense relation between Korea and Japanese rulers. The most publicized incident took place in December 1910 when the Japanese announced the discovery of a plot to assassinate the new Governor General Trachi Manstake, led by Ang Monggun, brother of An Chang-gun, who assassinated Ito Hirobumi. Some Koreans were detained, 123 arraigned, and in 1911, 105 were convicted. 3 others died during interrogation. These were some other similar sweeps and waves of arrest by the colonial administration. Under these repressive conditions, resistance to Japanese rule took place mainly among the exile community. From 1860, small number of Koreans began to cross the Yule and Tuman rivers into Manchuria and Siberia. Originally, some migration took place due to economic distress near the border region, beginning with the drought of 1860. Many Koreans migrated to Russia, maritime province, for both economic and political reason. A handful of Koreans lived in USA and Europe as students. These Korean communities became the homes of a number of small nationalist groups, some of which later played an important role in the Korean politics. The First March movement. Although there were small nationalist exile groups and descendants within Korea, from the time of Protectorate, a tiny national-wide Korean resistance movement to Japanese occupation first rose in March 1919. The end of the First World War and the Versailles Peace Treaty Conference inspired hopes for colonial people throughout the world. In part, this was sparkled by the peace settlement, in particular by President Woodrow Wilson of United States, who in his 14 points called in for the principle of national self-determination while this was meant only to apply to European people. The Korean diaspora, like so many non-Western colonial subjects, was greatly exiled by these events. An exile group led by Kim Shik went to Paris to argue for Korean independence. An attempt by the small Korean community in Hawaii through its Korean National Association tried to dispatch a delegation led by Swangman Rhee for the same purpose, but it failed when they were denied passport. The most significant of the developments outside Korea was among the Korean students in Japan. They organized a Korean Youth Independence Corps. In Tokyo, over 600 Korean students attended a meeting on February 8, 1919, where they passed a declaration written by intellectual and writer Y. Kwang-soo calling for immediate independence. The group then sent members to Korea in order to agitate for independence there. In Korea, several different groups were discussing independence in early 1919. The arrival of Korean students from Tokyo with news their calls for immediate independence and about activities of the exile group stimulated them to action. But the catalyst for the major action came with Korong's death on January 21, 1919. Rumors spread that the Japanese had poisoned him or that they had forced him to commit suicide, added to unrest. Taking advantage of the large crowds, they were expected to arrive in Seoul for the scheduled funeral on March 3rd. Representatives of the various groups decided to issue a declaration of independence in Pagoda Park in Seoul on March 1st, 1919. A petition was to be sent on the Japanese and US government and to Paris Peace Conference. Demonstration then took place on March 1st, 1919. From mid-March, protests took place throughout the country. Anti-imperialist demonstration took place throughout Asia and Middle East, including Egypt, China, and Philippines. A small radical group known as the National Congress called for a more violent action, but for most part, leaders to keep what they came to be known as the March 1st movement peaceful. The Japanese authority reacted by attempting to suppress the demonstration, often quite violently. The first March movement was a major turning point in the Korean history. It has been regarded by some historians as the birth of modern Korean nationalism. Others have seen it as not the beginning of Korean nationalism, but its transformation from a small movement of isolated and scattered intellectuals and of tiny exile groups abroad to a mass movement that cut across class lines. An impressive number of women, peasants, and non-elite urban and small town residents participated in it. A vision of Korea as a nation appeared to have emerged among many Koreans at this time. Domestically, the demonstration was suppressed without achieving independence by the embracement of Japanese government, and it led to change its policy towards Korea. The colonial period saw the emergence of an intense nationalism. Chronologically, the growth of nationalist movement within and outside the country coincided with the nationalist movement elsewhere in the colonial world, but was perhaps embraced more widely and more passionately than was the case in many other countries. The strong sense of Korean culture identity, the homogeneity of Korean society, and the intrusive and intense nature of Japanese colonial rule helped account for this. The exhaustive nature of Japanese culture and their presence in a land that was unaccustomed to foreigners contributed to the sense of Koreans as a distinct and different group. Some Koreans did accept the identity as members of a greater Japanese empire, but discriminatory practices only reinforced that fact that they were not Japanese. Even the effort of assimilation were contradicted by all sort of legal distinction that was still imposed on Koreans. In many ways, the nationalist movement in Korea was a typical one among colonial people in the first half of the 20th century. The Japanese rule, while allowing some scope for activities expressing ethnic and cultural sentiments, placed severe limits on overt political activity. Unlike many independence movements, there was no logical base or center for opposition. However, in contrast to many independence movements in Burma, Indonesia, India, or much of Africa, Korean nationalists did not have to deal with separatist movement. The boundaries and the unity of Korea were taken for granted. In many ways, it was a typical colony. The Japanese modeled much of their colonial administration on those of major European powers. In fact, Japanese colonialism can be seen as a late imitative form, part of that nation's effort to achieve parity with the great Western powers. The wartime aspects of Korea's colonial experience was historically unique. To summarize, the modern history of Korea was profoundly influenced by 35 years, 1910 to 1945, as a colony of Japan. The Japanese colonial regime established the basis of many of the economic, educational, governmental institutions of Korea, while its authoritarian rule, its mass mobilization, campaigns, and its attempt at forced assimilation touched the lives of many Koreans, often in disturbing and even traumatizing ways. As Korea responded to the demands, opportunity, and challenges presented by the colonial rule. The first decade of colonial rule was particularly harsh. What Koreans have called it as a dark period, because during the Japanese colonial rule, the Japanese treated very harshly with the Koreans and they were traumatized. They were harshly treated, they were detained, they were jailed, they were arrested, and no movements were allowed in Korea. No gatherings were allowed in Korea, no meetings were allowed in Korea. So there was a situation which seems to be a very traumatizing situation, and for every purpose, police permits were required, press was under tight condition, and there was no democracy in Korea during the Japanese rule. Koreans were not allowed to carry on their own weapons. Moreover, the administration was very harsh and very troubled during this period, and very critical situation took place during this period because in December 1910 there was a assassination of Trachi Manstek by An Mongan, brother of An Chungan, who assassinated Ito Hirobumi. Moreover, it seems that the situation became more harsh when small bands of Koreans began to cross the river Yul and Truman and went into Manchuria and Siberia. And this migration took place due to economic reason and due to the drought of 1860. Moreover, due to economic and political reason, migration took place to Russia, to USA and to Europe. But still, a small group of nationalists who played a very important role in the Korean politics. The most important incident that took place in Korea during this period of colonial rule was the March 1st movement. After the First World War and after the Versailles Peace Treaty, hopes and aspiration was inspired by all this peace conference among the colonial people, and the 14 points of President Wilson also inspired the colonial people and they wanted to become independent. So the Koreans also aspired for independence from the Japanese colonial rule. There were delegates, there were groups of people who were trying to bring about independence in Korea. During this period, there were around 600 Korean students who attended a meeting on 8 March 1919, where they passed a declaration written by the intellectual and writer Yai Kung-soo. And this was very important, for all of them urged for Korean independence. But the most important incident that took place was the death of Ko Jong. Ko Jong, and rumors spread that Ko Jong was assassinated by the Japanese, or he was forced to commit a suicide. So this incident took place, really instigated the situation, and people started demonstration in Korea, in Seoul, and in different parts of Korea. And this movement ultimately led to the First March movement, which was a very important turning point in the Korean history. And the First March movement was a major turning point in the Korean history. It has been regarded as, by some historians, as a birth of modern Korean nationalism. Others have seen it as not the beginning of Korean nationalism, but its transformation from a small movement to a mass movement across the class lines. An impressive number of women, peasants, non-elite, urban, small town residents all participated in the First March movement, and the First March movement was an very important movement in the Korean nationalist movement. The colonial period saw the emergence of intense nationalism, chronologically the growth of nationalist movement within and outside Korea, which coincided with the nationalist movement throughout the world. But it was perhaps the most important aspect of Korean nationalist movement, though this nationalist movement became intense and it spread throughout Korea, but it was repressed by the Japanese authority, but yet the Japanese authority were embraced through different incidents. Though this nationalist movement did not bring about great independence in Korea, but still it was a very important event. The First March movement was a very important event in the Korean history. Thank you.